Why is crime in America on the rise? Are Americans becoming more violent, or are bad criminal justice policies to blame? Could it possibly get any worse? Rafael Mangual has been researching criminal justice reform, decarceration, and depolicing over the last decade. He offers sobering insights and pragmatic solutions. To start, progressive prosecutors need to be held accountable for what they've done to our cities. So, Rafael, I'm so glad to talk to you because, honestly, I've been really worried. I live in Los Angeles, but anywhere I travel, even in Miami, it feels like crime is just soaring. I think parents around the country are having conversations about what is going on in our neighborhoods. I used to be able to just take a nice walk at night in my suburban neighborhood in Los Angeles and feel totally safe. And I honestly don't feel safe anymore. I don't feel safe going and filling up gasoline in my car. There are specific areas within Los Angeles, Beverly Hills. I used to go out with my girlfriends. Now I refuse to go with any jewelry or anything that might seem expensive. It feels to me like there is more crime. And so I'm curious if it's in fact true. And I know that you've been studying this for a very long time. And so let's have a little conversation about what is happening in America. What are specific neighborhoods where we need to be on alert? And what are the reasons that crime is really just on the rise? Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about your background and how did you become the person to speak to about criminal justice reform and crime in general?
I guess by accident is the short answer to that question. I mean, I'm originally born and raised in New York. My father was an NYPD detective, so from a very young age, I was very interested in criminal justice issues. I just thought it was the coolest thing that my dad was arresting people and fighting bad guys. And, at the time, when I was in kindergarten, New York City had 2,262 murders that year. So, crime was a big deal. You saw all these movies, these Charles Bronson movies on, WPIX on the weekends where, this was part of the narrative of New York, was that we were the sort of center of America's crime problem. And so, I grew up kind of with a very clear understanding that this was a really important issue, and also kind of having a front row seat to the fact that my dad was, intimately involved in pushing back against it. And so that's where my interest started. As I grew up, I got to watch New York City, the best city in the world, no offense to LA, transform. It was night and day. You went from 2,262 murders in 1990 to 292 murders in 2017. When I was a kid growing up in Brooklyn, I couldn't stay out, past the time the street lamps went on. My parents didn't want to get me the nice bike that I wanted because it might make me a target for theft, right? It wasn't until we moved to Long Island that I got the GT Dyno with the chrome body and all that stuff. By the time I was a teenager, New York was safe. When I went to college—
That was in the 90s.
Yeah, so in the 90s, New York was, again, one of the most dangerous cities in the world, right? I'm a little kid. I'm born in 1986, so 1990, I'm 4 years old. We moved to Long Island in 1996 when I'm 10. By the time I'm 18 and I'm going out with friends, we're going out in the city. We're staying out till 2 or 3 in the morning. We never felt unsafe. And I went to college in New York City and, again, just really enjoyed— I would ride the subway home from the bar at 3 o'clock in the morning. You take a nap and miss your stop. You never felt like you were putting your life at risk. And so I just really, I think, had a very intimate understanding of how valuable a commodity public safety is for a city. New York became the sort of place that you never wanted to send your children to go to school, to the place that people from all over the country and world were moving to start their lives over, to start new careers, to go to college. I developed a real appreciation for the importance of getting public safety right. And, as I got older, I started paying attention to these debates. And when I got to college, I realized very quickly that there was a large and growing cohort of New Yorkers that didn't fully appreciate the benefits that they were enjoying. And so when I was a sophomore in college, sitting in a sociology class, and we had a guest speaker who was an ex-con. It was a guy who had just been released from prison after serving time under the Rockefeller drug laws, which were our mandatory minimums for cocaine and heroin offenses. And he gave this diatribe about how the NYPD was racist and how the criminal justice system was racist and how it was all a rigged system and it was evil and we needed to dismantle it. And even back then was calling for defunding the whole thing and abolishing prisons. And I remember just sitting there and, with 200 other first and second year college students just thinking, this is crazy, but I didn't have a vocabulary to lean on in pushing back. And that was sort of the start of my intellectual journey. I went home, I went on Ask Jeeves, which was the popular search engine back then before
Wow.
Google became what it was. And I started researching, what could I have said in response if I wanted to push back? And I came across the work of the Manhattan Institute and George Kelling and James Q. Wilson and John DiLulio and these thinkers that were doing the hard work in the 1990s to make the case for the hardening of the criminal justice system that produced the benefits in the form of the crime decline. And I really wanted to be a part of that. So as I got through college, I kind of tried to figure out like how I could put myself on a path to do this kind of work, which is weird because you don't meet many college students who say, I want to work for a think tank when I grow up. But I started reading the resumes of people whose work I admired, people like Heather McDonald and John DiLulio. And, it just seemed like everyone either had a PhD in the social sciences or a law degree. And so I didn't want to go get a PhD, so I went to law school and just got really, really lucky in that I, had a friend of a friend who worked at the Manhattan Institute, which, kind of became a connection. And before I knew it, I was interning as a law student, and then I got a full-time job offer, and it's been the most rewarding possible
Did you
career.
Consider being a police officer like your father?
I did. So my senior year of college, I took the LSAT, and I also took the NYPD exam. And I got a perfect score on the NYPD exam. So, they give you a list number, which, sort of tells you the order in which you'll be hired within your test cohort. And my list number was 1. So I had the highest score in my test cohort. And I was really excited about this. And so I went home and I told my dad, who's an NYPD alum, and I said, hey, Pop, I took the NYPD exam and my list number is 1. Isn't that great? And his face just changed. Rather than being happy, you could tell that he was visibly disturbed. And, I was a little, taken aback and a little put off and asked him, what's the deal? Why don't you seem excited? And he was like, you think you're crazy if you think I want you to be a cop.
Why?
It's crazy because this was 2010, kind of before all the craziness that we're living through now. But even back then, he was saying, you could see the writing on the wall. He was like, no one, you think you're going to go out and save the world? No one is going to appreciate the effort that you put in. At the first chance that they get, they will throw you under the bus. The second you make a mistake, the second you do anything that looks bad on camera, you'll be plastered on the front page.
Even back then? This was when?
2010.
It's amazing that even back then they felt that way. Imagine what police officers feel now.
Yeah. No, that has been the one institution that has been derided and degraded at a level I don't think anyone has ever really seen a public institution like that go through. And it's been really problematic, not just for police recruitment and retention, which it has been. I mean, we've seen a massive decline in the class sizes of academies and in the number of police officers working in urban jurisdictions, but it's also been disastrous for the quality of policing. If you make policing the sort of job that only people without options want to do, the results are going to eventually start to show that, which is ironic because a lot of the vitriol is coming from people who say they want better policing, who say they're reform advocates. Yet at the same time, they are pushing a narrative that is both unfair, unjust, and untrue. And the effect of that narrative is to make this profession less likely to be inhabited by the kind of pro-social, high-performing, highly motivated people that produce good results. And who's going to fill the void? It's going to be the second tier, the people who are more likely to make mistakes, who are less likely to follow the law, who are more likely to sort of succumb to
just less motivated in general.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not going to be good for anybody.
Right. I don't think it's just in my mind or my friend's mind that crime is rising. I don't live in downtown LA. I live actually in suburbia. And as I mentioned, there is just a rise in crime. There's a rise in break-ins. I don't know if they will call it small crimes because I don't think it's small crimes, but there is a rise, which begs the question, what is happening? Is it bad policy? Is America becoming more violent? Why are we seeing more crime from your research?
Yeah, I think bad policy is definitely one of the biggest explanatory factors here. And you're not wrong. Crime is moving in the wrong direction. So 2020 saw the single largest one-year spike in homicides in American history. Over 100 years of data that we've kept relatively reliably, we have never seen a 30% spike in the number of people killed in a single year. And the number went up again in 2021. It looks like it went down very, very slightly in 2022, but we are in a very precarious place. At the same time, in 2022, we saw lots of other crime categories sort of catch up. I mean, the sort of line, the standard line for people who were skeptical of the crime rise, even if they were forced to acknowledge the homicide spike in 2020, they would say in the very next breath, but crime overall is down, right? Robberies are still down and burglaries are still down, which was true in raw numbers. What's interesting is that some researchers actually looked into this and figured out a way to account for the fact that because of the pandemic, people were spending much less time on the street, more time at home. Why is that important? Because if you spend less time on the street, you're less vulnerable to a street robbery. If you spend more time at home, your home is less vulnerable to a burglary because most people don't want to break into a house that's full of people, right? They want to break into an empty house. We saw car thefts spike in 2020. Why? Fewer people were using their cars. They were leaving them on the street for longer periods of time, right? That leaves them more vulnerable. So what these researchers did was they actually controlled for the amount of time that you were spending in public. And they looked at robberies and aggravated assaults. And your chances of being victimized, even in 2020, when those raw crime numbers went down, they were elevated.
So the criminals remained criminals.
Yes. What's really changed, really in the last decade, maybe 15 years, has been our policy orientation, right? So in the 1960s and 70s, criminal justice policy was fairly lenient. We didn't have a ton of people in prison and jail. There was a big shift, in terms of American jurisprudence that made criminal justice systems more flexible, a little more friendly to potential offenders. But in the 1980s and 90s, we really started to harden the system in response to the crime spike that we were seeing back then.
There was the broken windows, there's the 3 strikes.
3 strikes, truth in sentencing regimes, more proactive policing, the incorporation of data into the to inform the deployment of police resources. All of these things kind of harden the criminal justice system at all levels. But what we've seen really since about 2010, if not earlier, is a level of discomfort with maintaining a system that provided those benefits in the face of a crime problem that was severely diminished compared to what it was. And so there's been a longstanding push by activists to dismantle that system, to erode those protections. And so what we've seen on the policy front is a movement that has systematically lowered the transaction cost of committing a crime in the United States, while at the same time raising the transaction cost of enforcing the law by, for example, arrests down like 25% over the last decade between 2009 and 2019. The prison population is down about 24%.
But isn't that a good thing, having less prisoners in prison?
That's what people say.
Isn't that what they're saying?
That's what they say. The problem is that the sort of people who are likely to wind up in prison are very, very likely to offend when they're not in prison. And so we've lost out on the incapacitation benefits as a result of the decarceration that's happened over the last decade. We've seen that at the prison level. We've seen that at the jail level. We've seen that with arrests. We've seen declines in the number of police officers. We've seen a decline in proactivity among the police officers that remain on the job. So not just arrests, but also traffic stops, pedestrian stops, right? There's a 90% decline in stops and frisks in New York City. At the same time, we've seen the advent of the progressive prosecutor movement, where now some 40 million Americans are living in jurisdictions with self-described progressive prosecutors who are choosing not to prosecute whole categories of crime, are choosing not to pursue sentencing enhancements like 3 strikes, are choosing to affirmatively support parole bids for people who have gone through their office, or who are choosing to limit the ability of their line prosecutors to pursue pretrial detention, for example. We've seen bail reforms, discovery reforms. I mean, you're sensing a theme here. Everything that's been done over the last decade has made it easier to commit crime and less costly to commit crime. We've also seen a police reform movement that has really constrained the power of police, that has increased federal oversight of police, that has imposed on police unfunded mandates to report data, to collect evidence, to spend enormous amounts of money to house all of the body cam footage that gets recorded. I mean, the bytes upon bytes upon bytes of data that has to be kept on servers. I mean, that's expensive. No one's paying for that but the departments, which means that we have fewer resources to dedicate to those kind of traditional law enforcement functions. So everything has been unidirectional in the criminal justice policy front. And I think that when you lower the cost of something, you tend to get more of it. And when you raise the cost of something else, you tend to get less of that. And that's exactly what we've done to crime commission and law enforcement. And so it's not really surprising to me at all that we're at a point in which we're seeing crime numbers move in the wrong direction all over the country. Now, it is hitting most of America, right? Which is to say that, there are very few communities that have seen all crime, categories remain static. But when we're talking about the more serious kinds of violence, shootings, homicides, armed robberies, aggravated assaults, those do tend to be very, very hyper-concentrated, both geographically and demographically. And so, you and I are lucky in that, we're now suburban residents who can benefit from the degrees of removal from the sort of crime that's concentrated in urban centers and around urban centers. But that's a really important story to tell, because the people who have been pushing this reform agenda, they do it in the name of the disadvantaged. They do it in the name of inner city communities. They do it in the name of low-income minority neighborhoods that they
or
say—
fighting racism.
Right. There's something to their argument, right? It is true that the costs associated with a robust law enforcement apparatus, whatever those costs are disproportionately borne by low-income minority communities, right? We see that Black men are 5 times more likely than white men to end up in prison. They're significantly more likely to be arrested. They're, are overrepresented, if you use their a portion of the population as the denominator among people against whom police use force. All of these disparities in enforcement are taken to be prima facie evidence of racism built into the system, and that's a huge motivating factor for the kind of policy agenda that we've seen take shape over the last 10, 15 years. The problem, though, is that that same agenda has exacerbated the risks faced by this very community, which is why the subtitle of my book is what it is, right? It's who, what the push for decarceration and depolicing gets wrong, but also who it hurts most. And that's really fascinating because it reveals an irony that the people pushing this agenda haven't been forced to really grapple with yet. I mean, if you look at my home city of New York, for example, just start with the geographic concentration of crime. So 3.5% of our street segments, right? A street segment would be one side of a city block, both sidewalks. So corner to corner, 2 sidewalks. That's one street segment. 3.5% of our street segments see 50% of all the violence. That is an enormous amount of concentration. 1% of the street segments see 25% of all the violence. Now, demographically, if you just look at shootings, 97% of all shooting victims in New York City in 2021 were either Black or Latino. Every single year for which we have data, a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims are either Black or Latino. I can assure you that Black and Latinos do not constitute anywhere close to 95% of New York City's population, right? So when we talk about the more serious kinds of crime, we have to keep in mind that these are phenomena that are very, very hyper-concentrated in very small slices of our country and among very tight social networks within those neighborhoods, right? Because even in the highest crime neighborhood in America, the vast majority of residents are law-abiding, good people who just want to go about their lives.
So you would say that likely the folks that are involved in those crimes from those particular neighborhoods are the ones that are most likely going to be the ones who end up in jail, right? And so that's why it's disproportionately, Black and brown.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're going to look at enforcement disparities in a vacuum, you're not going to get very far in terms of a pursuit of truth, right? And that's one of the biggest beefs that I have with the reform movement is that they focus on these disparities in enforcement and they ignore the fact that there are other factors that are race neutral that you need to control for in order to do a valuable analysis, right? Like if we're going to learn something, we have to be honest about how we handle the data. You can't just say, well, this group is overrepresented compared to what their portion of the population is, because that presupposes that the portion of the population is a good predictor of what they should be within a particular setting, like prison. No, the right denominator is, the proportion of criminal offenders that they constitute or criminal victims, right? I mean, that's a really important thing. Like I said, the victims of these things are disproportionately low-income minorities, right? Why is that important? Because if police resources, if law enforcement resources are going to be deployed in response to where crime concentrates, which is exactly what it should be, well, then that means police are going to have disproportionately more opportunities to interact with whatever demographic groups are overrepresented in those geographic spaces. And we do know crime is concentrated geographically. If police go there and we know that Black and Latino residents are overrepresented in those communities, well, then police are going to have disproportionately more contacts with those people. We need to add that context into how we talk about enforcement disparities. The other thing about how people talk about racial disparities in enforcement is that it looks at enforcement as if it's the only output of the criminal justice system, right? But it's not, right? Yes, police make arrests, police use force, prosecutors prosecute, judges sentence people, to time in prison and jail. But when the criminal justice system operates well and it achieves its goals, crime goes down. And no one wants to talk about how evenly or unevenly distributed the benefits of crime reductions are. And they're just as unequally distributed as the costs. And when you incorporate the distribution of the benefits into the analysis, that really complicates things for people on the left, because they now have to confront the following rhetorical question, which is, why on earth would a system that is allegedly designed and operated for the specific oppression of low-income minority communities so disproportionately benefit low-income minority communities when the system works, when the system achieves its stated ends, when the system does what police chiefs say they're setting out to do? Right? And if you look at the homicide decline between 1990 and 2014 in this country, it added a full year of life expectancy to the average Black man's life. That is an enormous public health benefit. There's a researcher who did a paper on this that found that the public health equivalent of that would be to eliminate obesity altogether, right? So a full year of life expectancy for Black men. How much life expectancy did it add for white men? 0.14 years. That's an enormously unequal distribution. And so if you have police chiefs, prosecutors, judges in criminal courts who say that their goal, what motivates them, is to control crime, well, then you have to read that as an anti-racist agenda if there ever was one.
Right.
Because we know who's going to benefit the most from that project if it succeeds, and it's not rich white people.
It doesn't feel like their goal is actually to minimize crime. The message that we're hearing is that their goal is to lower the number of criminals in prison and lower the racial discrepancy, I guess, in arrest. But you never hear them actually say that what they want to do is actually reduce crime. You see that in their policies, right?
Well, I think that's true, especially for prosecutors, where we've seen the growth of the progressive prosecutor movement. I think that's true for judges, which have moved significantly towards this kind of decarceration orientation. I think it's less true for police. And one of the reasons I say that is because, if you just read a story about a homicide or a terrible crime that's been committed in a city, pick your city, whatever, jurisdiction you want to talk about, and they have any kind of detail about the suspect that's been arrested in that case, inevitably, you will see that that person has 10, 15, 20 prior arrests. They were out on bail. They were out on probation. They were just arrested last week and let go. What does that tell us? That tells us the police are still doing a pretty good job of spending their resources responding to crime and concentrating on people who pose a significant risk. But it also tells us that the rest of the criminal justice system is not operating as a backstop in the way that it used to. And that's really been the most significant change, right? Police are still making arrests. They're not being as proactive as they were. But that's out of, I think, an understandable fear that they're not going to be given a fair shake if they make a mistake, if they do something that looks bad on camera. But when they do make an arrest, prosecutors are less likely to prosecute. When they do make an arrest and the prosecutor prosecutes, the judge is less likely to hand down a serious sentence.
So the police officer feels, why bother?
Exactly.
Why
What's
take
a real
risk?
risk?
Why take a risk with your own life, with your own career, when the threshold is so high, and then you deliver the criminal, and then basically the prosecutors and the judges do nothing with it.
Right. Yeah. And even if they go to prison, the first chance that they get before the parole board, they get let out. Right. And so, this is really the kind of story that motivates me to do the work that I do. I'm just sick and tired of reading just example after example of some tragic crime that was essentially avoidable. Avoidable why? Because the person who committed it could have been behind bars.
Right.
It was a political choice to say, we're going to let him out. It was a political choice to say, we're going to give this kid probation, even though this is his third gun charge. It's a political choice to say, no, we're not going to pursue the third strike enhancement of an extra 25 years in this case, which means this guy's going to be out in 4. Why do we let them get away with it?
It's exactly the question I was going to ask you. I didn't mean to cut you off, but can you describe to me, who are these progressive prosecutors? What do they, who are they? What are they doing? Why do they believe what they believe?
I think they're genuine, true believers. I think they're wrong.
Are they just naive that they think that if they let the criminals out? What is their claim, and why are people electing them? I
think they make a few claims. Why are people electing them, I think, is an interesting question, because the progressive prosecutor movement, for all its electoral success, does not seem to have a particularly wide mandate, which is to say that if you dig into the details of these elections, right, they're mostly happening in deep blue cities, which means that the election outcome is essentially decided by the Democratic primary. And if you look at the turnout in Democratic primaries in these cities, it's not very high. So I think the reason for why people are voting them in is that not very many people are voting them in, but the people who do participate are just not particularly aware of how important these races are. And so that's I think, a big part of it. But, in terms of what these progressive prosecutors believe, I mean, these are people who are either defense attorneys as their background or civil rights litigators. And I think they genuinely believe the standard story about criminal justice, that, we have a mass incarceration problem, that, the system is the hammer comes down way too easily, and, people are being oppressed. And I think a lot of them think that prison or jail is itself criminogenic.
Yes.
So they'll say prison or jail, it's like a college for criminals. So they're going to come out so much worse off that it actually pays to divert them because you're reducing crime by not creating more of it. Now, this is where things get a little technical, because if you want to actually evaluate the effect of a treatment like incarceration on an outcome like recidivism, the gold standard in social science would be to conduct a randomized control trial, like an experiment. Now, you can't ethically experiment within the context of the criminal justice system, right? Because the implications are just disastrous. We can't say, like, okay, we know you murdered this guy, we're going to let you out just to see what happens, right? Like, that's an unethical experiment. So we can't randomize very much, right? And so, we have to account for the fact that there are really good reasons why people who get sent to prison get sent to prison. There are really good reasons why people who get diverted. And so if you're trying to build out an analysis that's going to tell you what the effect of incarceration is, you want to try and find little natural or quasi-natural experiments in the data. So what's random about the criminal justice process? One thing is who your case is assigned to in terms of a judge or in terms of a prosecutor sometimes, right? So like some prosecutors, some judges are more harsh than others, right? So what you do is you look at a jurisdiction and you categorize judges along a spectrum of leniency. And you put, the harsh ones at one end of the spectrum, the lenient ones at another one, and you kind of take out everyone in the middle. And you only look at the cases that get randomly assigned to the harsh judges and randomly assigned to the lenient judges. Now, you want to randomize for the offender, which you can't possibly do. So you get a big data set and you figure out, okay, like what kind of offenders are engaged in conduct that's not so serious that incarceration is a foregone conclusion, but also not so low level that, the diversion's a foregone conclusion, right? So like you identify a pool of offenders for whom whether they go to jail or prison is essentially a coin flip based on the judge that they draw. And for that subset of the population, there are some studies that show that prison produces worse outcomes. But here's the problem. There's a difference between the kind of marginal offender that body of research is looking at and the typical prisoner. The typical prisoner is a much higher risk proposition. And so there's a real limit to what that research can tell us. And this is a really dramatic error that the progressive prosecutor movement is making, to the extent that they're relying on this argument, because they're relying on a body of research and grafting it onto a population that it really doesn't apply to. And so it's a real major error. But the other thing is that I don't think they fully appreciate incapacitation as a rationale, right? I mean, when we talk about prison or incarceration, there are a few things that, make that a sensible policy response. One is incapacitation, which refers to the crimes that are avoided when someone's locked up, right? If they're behind bars, they can't victimize anyone in their community unless they escape, which is very, very rare, right? Then you have deterrence, right? By punishing people, we are discouraging other people in society not to
the message it sends.
Exactly, they want to avoid that punishment. You have rehabilitation, right? By virtue of our ability to coerce people, we can put them into programming that might, or therapy that might help reduce their recidivism or drug treatment. And then you have retribution, which is, you want to sort of satisfy society's desire to express their social condemnation of criminal behavior. And if we were rating this along a scale of importance, for me, incapacitation is at the top. Deterrence
just keep them away from our kids.
Exactly. Deterrence comes in at a relatively distant second. Rehabilitation and retribution are toward the very, very bottom. And the reason I say that is not because I'm against rehabilitation, but I'm a realist. And if you look at the literature on rehabilitation, it is pretty dismal. We have no idea. We have no idea how to reliably rehabilitate the median prisoner in the United States today. The idea that there is some readily deployable formula of therapy or treatment or medicine that can be given to cure criminality, and that that we can scale that solution across an incarcerated population of 1.8 or 1.9 million people. It's just, there's no basis for it in the literature. If you read the studies on rehabilitation, the findings are mixed at best. Generally, they show null effects. And the programs that do show promise, you see a lot of the same problems with the evaluations. One is selection bias. They're dealing with a population of offenders that either applied for the program or they're dealing with a program that excludes certain kinds of offenders. So you're already dealing with a subset of offenders who might be more amenable than the median population in prison to correction on some of these things. Another thing is like the scalability problem, right? The programs that succeed, they require very intense, either one-on-one or small group therapy, multiple sessions a week. I think, the sort of general thesis in the literature is that you need about 200 hours in order to achieve, reliable movement on the rehabilitation front. But when you have, 700,000 people in prisons, getting 200 hours for all of them, that's an incredibly huge lift that we don't have, the capacity to fulfill, right? I mean, the CDC is already predicting shortfalls of mental health workers over the next decade. That's going to be pretty significant. What makes us think that there are enough qualified mental health workers who can deploy these programs with reliable quality across a really wide population of offenders that varies, in settings that vary, that's going to be willing to take a job in a prison that's usually in a rural area for a municipal salary and work with pathological maniacs on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to going into private practice and charging someone, $800 an hour for therapy and, making $500,000 a year while working out of the basement of their Park Slope brownstone, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I know there are a lot of great nonprofits that try to do that work.
Sure.
I mean, one of the points that I learned from you, and really it contradicts what I've been hearing, especially in the media, is that people are being sent to jail or prison for very low crimes. And what I've learned from you in reading your book is that people actually negotiate down their sentence by taking responsibility for a lower crime or lesser crime. Can you explain that to me? Because I think when we're looking at the ledgers or the numbers, it appears as if the folks that are sitting in prison for these tiny little, criminal activities, but that in fact is not
No, that
correct.
is not the case. That's a story.
And that's pretty significant when we understand that.
Yes. So if you just look at 2021 data on people in prisons, in state prisons in the United States, state prisoners account for about 9 out of every 10 people in prison. 62% of state prisoners are in primarily for a violent felony. If you include weapons offenders, you get to more than 2/3 of the prison population just there primarily for a violent offense or a weapons offense, right? The rest of the people are there either for property felonies like burglary, which is a serious crime, arson, car theft, grand larceny, and then you have drug offenders, which are about 12 to 13% of prisoners. And people kind of latch on to those kinds of offenses, and they say, well, these are low-level, nonviolent, offenders. Why are they behind bars? What purposes is this really serving? And there are a couple of responses to that. One is that the idea that there exists static categories of offenders, right? The idea that the nonviolent drug offender is something that exists ignores a really important reality about criminal offending, which is that most offenders don't specialize. So if you just look at drug offenders and you look at the recidivism data, what you'll find is that 75% of people who get released from prison after serving time primarily for a drug offense will be rearrested for a non-drug crime. More than a third will be rearrested for a violent crime specifically. The other thing is that if you're looking at the typical person in a U.S. prison, the average prisoner, you're looking at someone who has between 10 and 12 prior arrests and between 5 and 6 prior convictions. So their criminal histories already exclude them from the category of low-level offender, right? These are people who have had multiple bites at the apple. The idea that prisons are overflowing with first-time offenders who have engaged in low-level conduct is nonsense. I was going to say a bad word there, but it is nonsense, right? I mean, only 40% of state felony convictions even result in a post-conviction prison sentence, which means that 60% of the time, a judge is either sentencing someone to time served in pretrial detention or to a sentence of probation, or the case is getting diverted into a diversionary program. So, prison isn't even the most common response to a felony conviction, let alone a misdemeanor conviction. So yeah, I mean, the idea that this is something that's reserved for low-level people is nonsense. The other thing you have to understand too is like when you're looking at official conviction data, we're looking at the crimes that people were actually convicted of. Now, the vast majority of convictions do not come via trials. I know lots of people watching may have watched, Law and Order, and they think that every case, gets litigated.
It's not like Hollywood?
No, not at all. Something like 95% of cases are resolved via plea bargaining.
Explain that, because that is so important for people to understand.
So most of the time, if someone gets arrested, charged with a crime, indicted, their case is going to be resolved by coming to an agreement with the prosecutor to avoid trial, right? So in exchange for allowing the state to save the time and money that it would take to go through the ordeal of a trial in order to convict them by a jury of their peers, the state will usually offer a benefit. And that benefit will come in the form of either downgraded charges, right? So, instead of first degree, we'll charge you with third degree, or the dropping of charges altogether, right? So you were charged with, illegal possession and, of a controlled substance and illegal possession of a firearm, right? So we'll drop the firearm charge. You plead guilty to the substance charge and, your sentence will be X instead of X plus 10. So not only does the official conviction record often understate the severity of the crime that someone actually committed, when you're looking at the prison population data, the categories of prisoners, right? If someone's categorized as a drug offender, all that means is that the offense that they are serving the most time for was a drug offense. It doesn't mean that that was the only offense that they were convicted of. So if, for example—
And it might even be their minimal offense, correct? Their smallest offense? Because they may have done a plea bargain.
Right, well, yes, exactly.
So that may have been the case, right? They may have committed a worse crime, but they were willing to take the plea bargain on a lower crime. And so that's where they're categorized, right?
So like, let's say you're arrested, you've got a kilo of cocaine in your trunk, and you've got an illegal pistol on your hip, right? So you're arrested, you're charged with illegal firearm possession and illegal drug possession. But because of the amount of drugs that you had in the trunk, the sentence that you're facing, let's say, is 10 years, right? Whereas a sentence that you're facing for the illegal gun is 3 years. Even if you're convicted of both of those offenses, the official prison data will categorize you as a drug offender because the drug offense carries the harshest sentence. So even the categorization doesn't necessarily reflect the seriousness of the population. The biggest thing that I think illustrates the risk that progressive prosecutors and other people pushing for decarceration are engaged in is that the recidivism numbers are horrendous. Somewhere between 80 and 83% of people who are released from a state prison will go on to reoffend at least once over 10 years. On average, those individuals will generate 5 rearrests in that period. And that, again, understates the severity of the problem. Why? Because the vast majority of crime that gets committed doesn't get reported, and the vast majority of crime that gets reported doesn't result in an arrest. It's not cleared. So the FBI up until 2020 would actually keep detailed records of clearance rates for the 8 index felonies that are tracked. These are sort of thought of as the 8 crimes that give us a general picture of crime. So there are 4 violent index felonies and 4 property index felonies. If you break out the violent index felonies, murder, rape, / sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault, and you look at the clearance rates, say, over the last 10 years, they hover at about 47 to 48%, which means that more than half of those offenses, which are the most serious kinds of felonies that you can commit, don't result in an arrest. Then you look at the property index offenses, so burglary, grand larceny auto, and arson. The clearance rate hovers at around 18%, which means that the vast majority go unanswered for. So when you're looking at the rearrest numbers for people who are getting out of prison, understand that for every arrest, they have probably committed a significant number of crimes that they did not get caught for. And this is something that's been confirmed by surveys of prisoners in the past where we've, asked people, how many crimes did you commit in the past year? And then you can kind of compare that with their arrest histories and, see that there's a delta. And so it's, that has been one of the most disastrous misconceptions that has informed policy, unfortunately. And, I think has really just exacerbated the risks. But they've exacerbated the risk primarily for the communities that can least afford to bear more of it. Again, if you look at the national data, the Black male homicide rate is 10 times higher than the white male homicide rate. That is one of the starkest and most persistent disparities in the criminal justice data sphere. And it just blows my mind that that doesn't do more to motivate, so-called progressives to rethink the policy agenda that they've been pushing for the last decade.
Right, help support the communities, actually make police officers want to serve there so they can protect people. The other new thing that I've been hearing a lot about is the cashless bail, right? That has been another one of those agendas that you're hearing prosecutors claiming that this is their way of helping with racial, inequality, but seems to actually, again, hurt the very community that they purport to help. what is the story behind this cashless bail stuff?
Yeah. So,
and is it actually catching momentum?
it's got lots of momentum.
It's
got lots of momentum. It's happening all around the country at different levels, either through state policy, through municipal policy, but also through agency policy, where prosecutors are just saying hey, we're going to place limits on the ability of our prosecutors to pursue pretrial detention of any kind.
We should explain what that means.
Yeah.
So this basically means the police officer finally catches the criminal, and they're up for prosecution, right? But the prosecutor basically says, go home, roam free until you come back in front of the court, and then we'll deal with you. And so the criminal gets caught, but then gets released right away with no bail, no nothing, correct?
Now look, that has been how it goes for almost all criminal offenders for almost all of time, right? The vast majority of people who get arrested are not flight risks, are not, serious violence risks. And so it makes sense that the vast majority of people get released on their recognizance, right? And even the ones that have bail imposed, right, they're able to make bail, and so they get out in a day or two if, they even go to jail at all. What the bail reform movement is really built around is a particular problem, which is a problem I'm sympathetic to, right? There's this idea that if we heavily rely on monetary conditions on release, right, on cash bail, then what you're essentially doing is building out a system in which a dangerous but rich defendant gets to go free when a harmless but poor defendant gets stuck behind bars, right? I don't want to see that happen just as much as, the most progressive bail reformer doesn't want to see that happen, right? The question is how do we go about addressing that problem? And modern bail reform basically says we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're going to essentially take cash bail off the table so that no one ever enters jail as a result of not being able to meet the monetary conditions that have been imposed on their release. But at the same time, we're not really going to do anything about the problem of releasing the dangerous people who really should be held behind bars. And so my response has been what we should do is reorient the pretrial release inquiry around risk instead of wealth, right? So you get arrested, the prosecutor decides to pursue the charges, you come up at your arraignment, and the judge, makes a decision about whether or not you should be released, and if so, under what conditions, right? Do you have to post bail? Will you have to wear an ankle monitor? Will you have to go to anger management? Will you have to abide by a protection order? These are all conditions on release. Or are you a danger to your community? In which case, you're going to go into jail until we resolve your case. Now, what New York did, for example, is it significantly reduced the circumstances under which bail could be imposed, which means that people are no longer going to be entering jail as a result of not being able to come up with bail at the numbers that they might have entered jail in years past. But New York also prohibits judges from considering the dangerousness of a given offender. And even in the jurisdictions, which by the way, New York is the only state in the union with that rule.
You got to explain that because the stuff is so mind-boggling that
crazy.
Sometimes I don't understand whether I'm actually hearing clearly.
It's
so the judge is not allowed to actually use critical thinking and judgment.
Correct. Judges are not allowed to judge one of the most important things in New York. So the guy can have 3,500 prior arrests, right? He can be up on a murder case. He can say, I'm probably going to kill somebody if you let me go. And a judge, by law in New York, is restricted to only the question of whether or not this person will return to court. So if someone says, I'll come back, but I'm also going to keep committing crime when I leave, technically a judge is supposed to release that person, right?
That's unbelievable.
So it's unbelievable. But, thankfully, New York is the only state in the union with that rule. But in the other places that have done bail reform, even the ones that have done bail reform relatively responsibly, right? Like New Jersey is a good example of this, where on paper their bail reform was really good. But in practice, right, it matters the quality of the judges and prosecutors working within the system, right? So on paper, people still weren't getting put in on remand by virtue of the fact that they were dangerous. And so what you need is not just a good reform that allows judges to reorient the inquiry around risk, but you also need judges and prosecutors who are willing to pull that lever into appropriate cases. And what we're seeing is that there's been a lot of movement among the ranks of prosecutors and judges where that's not a guarantee anymore. This isn't 1990 where you had prosecutors like Morgan Thau who were sort of on the same page as
Motivated
the
to
police.
keep everybody safe. I mean, what are they motivated by if it's
They're
not
pursuing
to keep...
reform. They see themselves as reformers first and law enforcement officers second. And the argument is basically that we're hurting children by denying the father figure through incarceration. And, you know, I can understand why this resonates with a lot of people, including people on the right, but it's very, very wrong because it relies on a really big assumption that makes a lot of sense.
That they're amazing dads and husbands.
Yes. I mean, you know, just like ask the basic questions here, right? Like the question is very, very obvious. Is the sort of person that's likely to end up in jail or prison the kind of person that's going to prove to be a reliable source of economic support and emotional support in their home? The kind of person who is not going to expose their children to trauma, that is going to succeed in the socialization process of younger children, right? I mean, the answer is there's no reason to think about this. I mean, again, we've gone through the criminal history data and through the recidivism data, right? We know, you know, just from that a huge portion of criminal offenders, particularly within carceral settings, are essentially antisocial in their disposition. And I'm using antisocial deliberately because it's a very important word. I'm using it in the clinical sense. There is a very, very large body of psychological research showing that even if you have two parents in the house, if one of those parents is antisocial in their disposition, that is going to produce significantly worse outcomes for the kids, even compared to kids who just have one parent that's pro-social, right? So yes, two parents generally better than one. But if one of those parents is antisocial, the results are
they're teaching
really,
them
really
that
bad.
behavior.
It's not just that they're teaching them that behavior. That's part of it. They're exposing them to trauma that exacerbates existing behavioral problems. But I think most importantly, especially when you're talking about younger kids who are still in the developmental stage, antisocial parents are just more likely to fail in the socialization process of children, right? Like, I think people have it in their heads that, you know, kids, because they're so angelic looking when they're born, are, you know, good inherently, and they learn how to be bad. It's backwards, right? Anyone who
Anybody who has kids knows that, right? Who actually paid attention.
They are uncivilized savages, right? Like we teach them.
We all are, right? We just need to learn, right?
Exactly, right? So, I mean, there's this, I can't remember his name now, but there's a psychologist in Canada who did this, you know, famous analysis that found that, you know, your kind of highest risk of violent victimization is between the ages of like 2 and 3. Because you're around other toddlers in daycares and they hit you and they bite you and they pull your hair and they take your toys and, you know, but over time, our parents, our teachers, our community members.
We teach them with consequence.
Exactly.
Right?
Right. We teach them how to be pro-social. We teach them language so that they don't need to use violence, right? They can use their words and, you know, but that socialization process is not a given. It can break down. And it's much more likely to break down if the parent who's tasked with the socialization of children is antisocial themselves, right? And so then the question becomes, is there any reason to think that the typical person incarcerated is antisocial in his or her disposition? And the answer is yes, because we've actually surveyed prison populations and looked at the prevalence of something like antisocial personality disorder, which is a psychological diagnosis. And in the general population among men, antisocial personality disorder has a prevalency rate of about 2 to 4%. In prison settings, it varies between 40 and 70%. That is an enormous disparity and a huge clue as to what you're exposing kids to if you decarcerate and put these fathers back in the home. It's not at all a given that this is going to be a net positive for kids. And so researchers have actually started looking at this question. There have been a few studies that have actually looked at whether kids whose parents get incarcerated do better than similarly situated kids whose parents don't. And surprisingly to some, the findings have been that the kids whose parents go to jail do better. They have more educational attainment, fewer behavioral problems, they're less likely to get arrested. Same thing for sibling incarceration, right? If you have an older brother who goes to jail, there are a couple things that are gonna happen. One is you might be deterred by seeing the system come down on somebody so close to you. But the other thing is that brother, if he doesn't go to jail, is more likely to introduce his younger brother into a criminal
network. Bring them in.
Right? And the younger brother's going to look up to the older brother. And so it's only natural. And so what you have to do is really break the cycle. And the way that you do that is by extracting deeply pathological antisocial people from their communities. And that gives those communities the room to breathe. That makes those households more habitable places. It makes those kids' lives less traumatic, more stable. and gives them opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have. And this is counterintuitive for a lot of people.
Right.
But if you care about children's outcomes, you have to at least grapple with what this literature says.
Right.
And people just aren't willing to do that. And that's one of the things that I really wanted to change about our debate with this book.
I think when you talk about the cycle, so much of it is also tied to the culture, right?
Yeah.
Police can do so much. A portion of it is these, progressive prosecutors and just the fact that A, you can't catch everybody, B, they're lowering the sentencing. But then the other side of it, when we talk about the culture, this celebration of criminality, the music, the environment. I mean, you talk about that environment growing up where you had to prove that you can be violent so that nobody will mess with you. That's a big part of it. And so you have this combination of the glorification of being violent in music and in these neighborhoods, plus the fact that we are essentially not laying in the consequence for criminals. And so you have these kids growing up in these environments where, that's pretty much all they know, and we're not willing to extract it out of their lives.
Yeah, no, I think culture plays a big role. There's a chapter in the book where I talk about, the sort of culture of violence, and I draw a lot on the work of a researcher called Elijah Anderson, who wrote this really fantastic book that I encourage all of your viewers to read. It's called Code of the Street. It was written in the early 1990s, and it's basically, an ethnographic anthropological assessment of Northern Philadelphia in the early 1990s. And what he does is he sort of documents this street culture, this set of social mores that guides day-to-day life in one of the most dangerous parts of America at the time, and still one of the most dangerous parts of America today. And, what he finds is that violence is essentially elevated in these, neighborhoods as a legitimate means of respect acquisition, as a legitimate means of dispute resolution. And also, what he finds is that violence actually is viewed by younger people as a defense mechanism. If I show that I am willing to be violent, if I display in my outward-facing appearance a comfort with and proximity to criminality, that actually heads off potential aggression in the future, because people become less likely to mess with me if they don't think that
Gain
I'm
respect.
soft. Exactly. So now, if I'm perceived as soft, however, then I'll get picked on, I might get robbed, I'll be singled out, I'll be beat up. And so it actually pays in some parts of the country to have this kind of tough guy persona. And the problem with that is that it can have deleterious consequences. It can put you in situations that you don't actually really want to be in, because eventually there's going to be somebody out there who's going to pull your card.
Yeah.
And you will be forced to fight, and maybe you didn't really want to. And, the fact of the matter is that crime is itself criminogenic, right? We talk about the criminogenic impact of prison. But, if you have a fight in a really high crime neighborhood, it doesn't necessarily end there. That turns into, well, next time my friends see, the guy that beat me up, we're going to jump him. And then they're going to come back and jump one of our guys. And then maybe it escalates into a shooting. And now we've got this retaliatory cycle of violence that only happened because of that one fight, or because of, a social media diss, when someone, by virtue of that culture feels like I have to respond to this, right? You'll see there's a famous rapper, Tekashi 6ix9ine is his name, and he's got all these tattoos on his face and his hair's a bunch of different
I
colors.
listen to him all the time. Just kidding. I have no idea who that is.
But there was this episode where, he went into this really dangerous gang territory in Chicago and filmed himself, talking about O Block and, this is no block, there's nobody outside, right? And then puts it up on social media. And that's now seen as, an affront to which that has to be responded to. And that's the sort of subculture that is really driving a lot of this crime. I've spent time with police officers in different departments around the country. And one of the things that I've heard consistently, and I'm talking, like Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, you name the city, and they are saying the same thing, which is that a lot of their shootings start online.
Wow, I didn't even think about that. It's just another one of those pitfalls of social media.
Yep. And so, when you have this kind of culture that, sort of glorifies violence, that's going to really raise the stakes. Because if you continue to have people responding to social affronts violently, that is going to create the conditions that might kick off some of these retaliatory cycles of violence, and they get out of control very, very quickly.
What's fascinating and possibly even ironic is the people who are pushing for this criminal justice reform are saying nothing about this culture.
Yeah, but I think one of the other reasons we don't see a lot of people address the culture issues because it's not something that really lends itself to an obvious solution, right? I mean, there really isn't a policy prescription, you know, that is sort of consonant with even, you know, conservative or libertarian thought that, you know, places the government in a position to affect the culture.
We would never want that.
Yeah, I mean, no one, you know, who in their heart of hearts actually thinks that the government knows what the right culture is, let alone how to implement that, and wants to give the government the kind of power that it would take, right? This is really one of those issues where the solution has to come from within.
Right.
The community has to look within and say, enough is enough. We're going to make this change. How do you get there? That's not a question I have an answer to.
Part of it is also education. If they're miseducated and they're told that the only reason they're in prison is because the system is corrupt and set up against them, then you're actually pointing them in the wrong direction for an actual pragmatic solution, right? And I think that's another big why it's so important that actually they read your book, because if they want to solve the problems in their communities, if we want to solve our problems in downtown Los Angeles, we need to look at the real facts and not, you know, get distracted by you know, things that are not real problems.
Yeah, I mean, look, rhetoric is powerful. It always has been, right? You know, stories are powerful. And if you are a kid growing up and you've got, you know, 2 generations of parents and grandparents telling you that, you know, your position in this country is, you know, as an oppressed person, and you're living within this infrastructure of white supremacy, and they're never going to let you get anywhere. And then at the same time, you scroll through social media and you see these videos of viral police incidents. The use of force looks really, really bad. You know, Tyree Nichols, George Floyd. And, you know, it becomes really easy to conclude like, oh, they're right. And so I'm going to disengage. Or I'm going to double down on this sort of alternative subculture that isn't really going to get me anywhere. And that's really tragic. And so, you know, what I really wanted to do with this book is kind of meet the other side where they are, right? Let's talk about disparities. Let's talk about, you know, the victims. Let's talk about these communities. And hopefully in doing that in an honest way that elevates the data, that gently, but also forcefully, right? Like but without taking pleasure in, like, you know, I think there are too many people who just say like, you know, I'm right, we're going to own the libs, ha, ha, ha. And, like, you know, there's a place for that sometimes. I get it. I understand the instinct. But at the same time, you're not going to make progress if you convince the other side that you hate them. Right. And that's something that I think conservatives today should really understand because, you know, I live in New York City right now. You know, we're in Los Angeles. There are lots of parts of this country where there's just open hostility to anyone who expresses a conservative viewpoint. And so it's not crazy that, you know, conservatives around the country have sort of come to the conclusion that the left just doesn't just disagree with them. It, you know, sort of hates them and, you know, resents their very existence. But so you don't want to be guilty of that too. And I think if you go about this conversation in the right way, be as honest and straightforward as you can about your reading of the data, we can make progress. And if we do that, I think we sort of discourage the kind of self-insulation that really provides a kind of breeding ground for the worst elements of, you know, a given culture. And, you know, if you can open up those doors and you can head off those cycles of violence by taking bad actors off the street, then you can start to make things better. And, you know, the reason I'm so confident in saying that is because it's something that we've already done in our relatively recent history. Again, 1990 New York, 2,262 murders. 2017 New York, 292 murders. If you look at the growth, the investments in the outer boroughs with mostly minority populations, places like the South Bronx and East Brooklyn, you know, it's been an enormous, just uplifting amount of change. These communities have grown and blossomed in ways that would have never have even seemed fathomable to, you know, people who had been living for generations, you know, in places like the South Bronx through the 1980s. I mean, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, it would not have been unusual to walk around the South Bronx and see like an entire city block with maybe one standing structure, where just, you know, vacant lots, you know, collapsed buildings, dilapidated structures, no street lighting, you know, very few businesses, almost no CCTV cameras, very little foot traffic. As you get crime under control, you make these places more attractive to investment. You see businesses pile up. What do businesses bring? They bring foot traffic, they bring car traffic, which means more eyes on the street, which makes those places less conducive to certain kinds of crime. They bring better street lighting, more tax dollars, more CCTV cameras. All of this stuff discourages crime. And the built environment is important. There are studies showing that just greening a vacant lot will reduce shootings. Why? Because the vacant lot provides a physical environment that cannot be easily replicated somewhere else. There are only so many vacant lots in a neighborhood.
And the broken window theory, right? People 100%. Don't say, oh, why bother?
Exactly, right? If you communicate that someone is in charge of public spaces, that
Somebody
gives
cares.
the pro-social parts of a community the confidence that they need to reassert themselves within those public spaces, right? What happens in places with high levels of disorder, places like downtown Los Angeles, places like San Francisco, where you have essentially surrendered public spaces to open air drug dealing, open air drug use, tent cities, it communicates that no one's in charge here, right? If I'm walking down the street and I see someone urinating on a sidewalk, right? The way that I process that psychologically is like, okay, that guy thinks he can get away with this because he's confident that no one's going to say anything to him.
And he's right to be confident because he can get away with it.
And if he can get away with that, he can get away with anything. And if he can get away with anything, I probably shouldn't be here because I'm not safe. And what happens? Pro-social people leave, and then those public spaces become increasingly more vulnerable, not just to disorder, but also to more serious kinds of crime, which is exactly what we see. And so it's just really frustrating because we're repeating the errors that we made in the 1970s and 80s, and we're eschewing the lessons that we learned in the 1990s and 2000s. It's like, we did this once, we can do it again. It's just a matter of political will.
Do you think that America is waking up? Do I live in a bubble? I mean, I just feel like everybody around me, including the classical liberals, they seem to be very upset about the crime because it is, as I mentioned earlier, it is coming into suburban neighborhoods. It is impacting them. Women are scared to fill up gasoline. All of these things. Are they waking up? Are they connecting the dots? Are they realizing these progressive prosecutors are actually not serving our communities? Is this our time? Is this a time where people are going to actually start looking at it not from the lens of left versus right, but actually the lens of common sense? Let's keep our neighborhood safe. Like, we want to live here, right? Is there any glimpse of hope in the mayor of Chicago now being on, maybe?
Maybe. I mean, look, I think we're starting to see people pay attention. But it's a long process, right? Even in the 1990s, it took a long time for people to finally come around. Things had to get really, really bad.
You think even worse than they are now?
I do, unfortunately.
Boy, this conversation.
It's not super hopeful. But look, there's a crime historian named Eric Monkinen that I quote in the book, and sometime in the 1960s or even 50s, I think it was. He said that, crime was going to follow a cyclical pattern. Essentially, crime would go up, that would inspire a kind of hardening of the criminal justice system, which would then cause crime to go down. And then as crime got really low, people would grow more and more uncomfortable with a robust enforcement mechanism in the light of, a decreasing crime problem. And so they would start to erode the system, and that would then create the conditions for the next crime rise, which is kind of where in the cycle I think we are. The hope is that every time the pendulum swings past the point of equilibrium, it doesn't go as far past the point of equilibrium as it did the last time. So I don't think it will take us as long as it took us in the 1990s to come back around to common sense. But I do think we have a little ways to go, especially in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco and Chicago and New York and Philadelphia, these kind of really deep blue enclaves where you have to overcome not just the sort of common sense inclinations of people living out in the suburbs and in the surrounding areas, but also you have to overcome the just unbridled radicalism of, the blue-haired, nose-ringed progressive, who wants to see the system burn. There's still a lot of that. They're super active. They have very loud megaphones, and they drive policy still.
Wow.
Just look at what's been happening. Despite the crime rise, lots of cities have still been pulling reform levers, right? Illinois is pushing forward with the Safety Act. New York has got a whole slew of new decarceration efforts that were just proposed in Albany. They haven't rolled back the bail reform. They haven't rolled back the discovery reform. In 2021, they passed a parole reform. I mean, more progressive prosecutors were elected to new offices in 2022. Others were reelected. We haven't yet seen the backlash. We haven't yet seen the worries that you're starting to see in your community translate into policy. I think it's going to take a while before that happens. I just hope, that people understand that the longer we wait, the more people are going to suffer and die and be hurt. And, again, it's not, and we talk a lot about homicides and shootings, as we should, they're really serious offenses. But, something like a burglary is still important. You walk into your house and it's been emptied while you weren't there. Some people will never feel secure again in their house.
Very violating.
I mean, I know people who've moved because their house got robbed.
It is getting scary. And anybody who's listening now, what can Americans do to see this change happen as soon as possible?
Educate yourself. Push back on the narrative. Don't let them get away with the idea that they have a monopoly on empathy for, vulnerable communities. We care too. We care too. Don't tell me that I don't care about low-income minority communities. I do. And people need to have the courage to push back. You're probably going to get called a bigot or something like that, but don't let that faze you. We have to get involved. We have to push back. We have to show up in elections.
Especially the local elections.
Local elections,
right?
prosecutor races, they matter enormously. Judges, I know it's really easy to just vote, D down the line or R down the line, but look into the candidates, do a little homework, get out there, keep track of what's being proposed in your legislature or city council, and make your voices heard.
We got to do the work.
You got to do the work. Otherwise, there's a saying, you can either do politics or have politics done to you. And in a lot of ways, this is a political problem, which means it requires a political solution. The good news, I will leave you with one bit of good news.
Okay, good.
The good news is that we have a pretty decent idea of what to do. We won on this issue in the past. We largely solved this problem in the past. That means that we can do it again. It's just a matter of whether or not we're going to learn from those lessons.
Great. Well, thank you. It's great having you here.
Great to be here.